My name is Nora Calloway, and I found out my future had been sold on a Tuesday morning while I was making coffee. The notification came from my bank the way bad news always does, quietly, without warning, in between the unremarkable moments. I was standing at the kitchen counter in my apartment, still in yesterday's socks, waiting for the brew to finish. My phone buzzed. I glanced down, expecting a delivery update or a promotional email from some store I'd shopped at once and never thought about again. Instead, it was an alert from the joint savings account my parents had opened for me when I was 16. The one my dad called Nora's Ladder. The one that was supposed to pay for the graduate program in environmental law I had spent 3 years building my entire life around. The balance read $47. I set the coffee mug down before I dropped it. I checked again. Same number. $47, where 11 months ago there had been 22,000. I sat on the edge of the counter and stared at that number until the coffee finished brewing and started going cold. My parents hadn't called, hadn't texted, hadn't left a voicemail or a sticky note or sent a single word in my direction to let me know that the account they'd promised me, the one my dad mentioned at every family dinner like it was proof he was doing something right, had been emptied. I found out from an automated bank alert, the same way you find out your subscription renewed. I didn't cry right away. I just kept thinking about the acceptance letter sitting in the top drawer of my desk, the one from the Hartfield School of Law. The one I'd read so many times the fold lines had gone soft. The one that said full-time enrollment begins in September and required a deposit by the end of the month. The end of the month was in 11 days. Before I tell you what I did after that Tuesday morning, and how the truth I uncovered in the weeks that followed unraveled something my family had been keeping carefully hidden for years, I want to ask you something. Tell me in the comments what time is it where you are, and where are you watching from? And has anyone ever made a decision that cost you everything and not even bothered to tell you? Because I need to know I'm not the only one who had to find that out alone. I grew up in Clover Ridge, a mid-sized town in the Ohio River Valley where everyone knew everyone's business except, apparently, their own. My family looked fine from the outside. My dad, Richard, worked in regional sales for a manufacturing company. My mom, Diane, ran the front office at a pediatric clinic. We had a house with a vegetable garden my mom never watered enough and a garage full of my brother's old lacrosse equipment. We had Sunday dinners and holiday photos and the kind of surface-level normalcy that doesn't ask too many questions. My brother, Daniel, was 3 years older than me and had always been the version of a child my parents understood best. He was loud where I was quiet. He was impulsive where I was careful. He lit up a room in the way that made people stop their conversations and turn toward him, and my parents had always responded to that light the way moths do, helplessly, instinctively, without any awareness of the heat. I was the other one, not invisible exactly, but dim. I was the one who got good grades without needing to be reminded, the one who worked 2 part-time jobs through college without asking for help, the one who handled her own crises quietly and showed up to every family obligation on time and didn't require managing. My dad once told a neighbor that I was the easy one, and he meant it as a compliment, and I had nodded and smiled and said nothing about how much it cost me to make everything look so easy. After the bank notification, I didn't call my parents right away. I sat with it for 2 days, which sounds strange, but I needed to understand what I was walking into before I walked in. I called the bank on the second day and confirmed what I already knew. The account had been accessed using my dad's credentials, which were listed as a co-owner from when I was a minor and had never been updated, because I had trusted him and it had never occurred to me that trust needed paperwork. The money had been transferred in 3 installments over 4 months, all to the same external account. On the 3rd day, I drove to my parents' house on a Sunday when I knew both of them would be home. My mom was pulling weeds in the front garden. My dad was in the kitchen watching a game. Neither of them looked like people who had done anything wrong. That was the part that got me. I sat at the kitchen table, and I told them I had seen the account balance. The room changed. My mom came in from outside and stood in the doorway with her gardening gloves still on. My dad muted the game but didn't look at me right away. "We were going to talk to you about that," my mom said. "When?" I asked. Neither of them answered immediately, which was its own kind of answer. My dad finally turned to face me. He told me that Daniel's tech startup had hit a wall 6 months ago, that his investors had pulled out. That Daniel was about to lose everything: his apartment, his equipment, the small team he'd hired. He said Daniel had come to them desperate, and they hadn't known what else to do. He said they believed it was a temporary solution. He said they planned to pay it back before I needed it. I asked them if they had considered telling me. My mom said they hadn't wanted to worry me. I looked at the two of them, my dad with his hands folded on the table, my mom still wearing her garden gloves, like she was ready to go back outside the moment this was over, and I understood something that I hadn't let myself understand before. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't an oversight. They had made a decision, weighed two futures on a scale, and chosen without a moment of doubt. Daniel's crisis had been urgent. My plans had been something to figure out later. I told them the deposit for Hartfield was due in 11 days, and asked how they intended to fix this. My dad said he'd talk to Daniel. My mom said they would figure something out. Both of those answers were so hollow I could hear the echo inside them. I drove back to my apartment and did something I had never done before in 29 years of being the easy one. I sat down and I let myself be furious. I didn't post anything. I didn't call anyone. I just sat in my car in the parking garage under my building for a long time and let the anger move through me without swallowing it back down the way I always had. And when I finally went upstairs, I opened my laptop, not to do anything yet, just to think clearly somewhere other than inside my own head. My dad called that evening. He said he'd spoken to Daniel. He said Daniel felt terrible and that he was going to pay me back as soon as the business recovered. He said to give it a couple of months. He said I could defer my enrollment. I asked if Daniel knew the money had come from my graduate school account. There was a pause. He knew it was from savings, my dad said carefully. So he knew. He had known, and he had taken it anyway. I deferred my enrollment that week not because I accepted the situation, but because I needed time to think, and 11 days wasn't enough. Hartfield gave me 1 academic year. I marked the new deadline in red on the calendar above my desk, and I started making a plan. In the meantime, I kept going to work at the environmental consulting firm, where I'd been a research analyst for 4 years. I kept showing up to Sunday dinners, which sounds insane, but I had learned early in life that when you stop showing up, people fill your absence with their own version of events. I needed to keep watching. I needed to understand the full shape of what I was dealing with. 2 months after the conversation at the kitchen table, Daniel came to Sunday dinner with a new laptop and talked for 40 minutes about a second funding round he was pursuing for a revised version of his startup concept. My parents listened with the specific quality of attention they reserved for him, leaning in slightly, eyes bright, asking follow-up questions. My mom had made his favorite dessert. My dad called the new pitch smart pivoting. I had brought a folder of documents I'd been quietly compiling. I left it in my bag and said nothing about it that night. What I had been collecting, carefully and without saying a word to anyone, was evidence. Not for drama. Not for revenge. Because I had started to realize that the story my parents told themselves about what had happened, temporary setback, we'll fix it, Nora understands, was a story that would keep being told until something interrupted it. And the only thing that could interrupt a story that convenient was the truth, documented and undeniable. I had the bank records showing the 3 transfers. I had my original acceptance letter from Hartfield. I had an email chain between my dad and Daniel from 8 months ago. My dad had accidentally forwarded me part of it while trying to reply to my message about Thanksgiving plans, in which Daniel had explicitly asked if I could use the savings account, and my dad had written back, "She'll be fine. She always lands on her feet. She'll be fine. She always lands on her feet." I read that sentence for probably 30 minutes the first time I found it, not because it surprised me, because it confirmed something I'd spent years suspecting but telling myself I was imagining. I hadn't been the easy one because I required less. I had been the easy one because they had decided not to worry about me, and then used my not complaining as proof they'd been right. The following week, I was at my parents' house helping my mom sort through some boxes in the spare room she was redecorating and wanted to clear out what she called the archive, which was really just 20 years of accumulated family clutter. I had offered to help because I am still, apparently, a person who shows up when asked, even when I am quietly furious. I was moving a stack of banker's boxes toward the closet when one of them caught on the edge of the shelf and dropped. Papers fanned out across the floor. Old tax documents, birthday cards, a thick rubber-banded stack of letters. I gathered them up without reading them, but the return address on the top envelope stopped me. It was my grandfather's handwriting. My dad's father, who had died when I was in high school, and who I remembered mostly as a quiet man who smelled like pipe smoke and seemed to carry some private heaviness he never explained. The envelope was addressed to my dad and dated 31 years ago. I shouldn't have read it. But I am my father's daughter in at least one way. I am very good at recognizing patterns, and something about the weight of those letters told me they mattered. I took a photo of the top 3 pages before I put everything back. That night, I sat at my kitchen table and read them carefully. My grandfather had written to my dad during a period when my dad was in his mid-20s, apparently struggling after a business venture of his own had failed. The letters were practical at first advice, some financial guidance, but in the second letter, something shifted. My grandfather wrote about my dad's older brother, my Uncle Gary, who had always been the one the family invested in, celebrated, protected. He wrote about how he had given Gary money that should have been split equally, how he had told himself it was because Gary needed it more, how he had told himself my dad was stronger and would figure it out. He wrote, "I told myself you were the resilient one." That was the story I used to avoid the harder question, which was whether I was willing to do the difficult thing and treat you the same. I wasn't, and I have regretted it, in ways I don't have the right words for. I put the phone down on the table and sat very still. My dad knew what this felt like. He had been me. Once. He had been the one his father hadn't worried about because worrying was easier to direct at the louder child. And somewhere between being that young man and becoming a father himself, he had not broken the pattern. He had just changed which child he placed at the center. I wasn't going to pretend that made it okay. But it gave the shape of everything a new dimension, one that made the anger in my chest more complicated than I wanted it to be. I started writing things down that night. Not for anyone else. Just for myself, the way you do when you need to see something outside of your own head to know it's real. I filled 6 pages in a notebook. All the times I had adjusted. All the times I had held the weight quietly. All the times Daniel's emergency had been treated as a family crisis, and my setbacks had been treated as character building. The car my parents had co-signed for him at 24. The lease they'd helped him with at 26. The money they had lent him twice before this money that, as far as I knew, had never been fully repaid. And now this. I thought about the Hartfield letter in my desk drawer. I thought about the 11 months I had left before my deferral expired. I thought about what it would mean to walk away from this quietly, the way I always had, and I decided I was done making that choice. I called my dad on a Thursday evening. He answered on the second ring, which he always did for me, as though my calls were administrative rather than emotional. I told him I had found his father's letters. The silence on the other end of the line was the longest pause I had ever heard from him. I told him I wasn't calling to hurt him with them. I told him I was calling because I needed him to understand that what his father had done to him and what he had done to me were not different things dressed in different clothes. They were the same thing, the same calculation, the same quiet decision that one child's future was more urgent than the other's. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said, very quietly, "I didn't think about it that way." I told him I knew. I told him that was the problem. I also told him that I had the email he had sent Daniel, the one that said she'll be fine. Another silence. Longer this time. I told him I wasn't going to disappear quietly. I told him I was done being the child who handled things on her own so the family didn't have to. I told him that if Daniel and I were being treated like different categories of person in this family, I needed everyone in the family to know that and make peace with it, because I was no longer going to protect anyone from the consequences of what they had chosen. My dad asked me what I meant by that. I told him I was going to talk to my aunt and uncle at the upcoming family gathering the following weekend. That I was going to tell them what had happened. That I wasn't going to perform normalcy anymore while my graduate school account sat at $47. He said, "Please don't do this in front of everyone." I said I wasn't doing anything. I was just going to tell the truth. If the truth was uncomfortable in public, it had been uncomfortable for me in private for a long time. The family gathering was my parents' anniversary party, a casual backyard event my mom had been planning for weeks, 40 or so relatives and family friends, the kind of afternoon that usually passed in a warm blur of potato salad and old stories. I drove there alone, and arrived a little late, on purpose. My aunt and uncle were near the drink cooler when I found them. We talked normally for a few minutes. Then my aunt asked how the law school preparation was going. She had always been the one who asked about me specifically, remembered specifics, followed up. I told her there had been a complication. I told her the savings account had been emptied without my knowledge, transferred to cover Daniel's business losses. I told her calmly, without drama, the way you tell someone a fact about weather. Her face changed. She asked if I was serious. I said yes. I said the deposit deadline had already passed once and I was working on a plan to cover the next enrollment cycle on my own. Within about 20 minutes, the information had moved the way information moves, through families not loudly, but steadily, person to person, until the air in the backyard had a different quality than it had before. I hadn't made an announcement. I hadn't raised my voice. I had told one person who cared about me and let the truth do what it does when it stops being managed. My mom found me by the rose bushes near the back fence. Her voice was controlled, but her eyes were wet. She said I had no right to air family business at their anniversary. I said I had been asked a direct question about my future by someone who genuinely wanted to know, and I had answered honestly. She said I was trying to embarrass them. I said, very clearly, that I was not embarrassed to tell the truth. I said if they were embarrassed, that was information about how they felt about what they had done. She walked back toward the patio and I stayed by the rose bushes for a few minutes, breathing slowly. Daniel appeared about 10 minutes later. He looked like a person who had been ambushed, which I suppose he had been. He said he hadn't realized how serious the situation was for me. He said he'd thought of it as money that was just sitting there. He said he was going to pay it back. I asked him when. He said soon. I asked him to define soon. He didn't have a number. I told him I needed a written repayment agreement with a specific timeline by the end of the month, or I was filing a formal complaint with the bank because the account terms gave me grounds to report unauthorized use. I said it without anger, the way you state the terms of a contract. He stared at me like he was meeting me for the first time. I told him I wasn't trying to punish him. I told him I needed my future back, and I was going to get it one way or another, and it would be easier for everyone if he cooperated. The drive home that afternoon felt longer than usual. I played the same song 4 times without noticing. When I got to my apartment, I sat at my kitchen table for a long time and thought about all of it, the party, my mom's face, the way Daniel had looked when I gave him a concrete deadline. I thought about my grandfather's letter and the phrase, resilient one, and the way it had been used by one generation to justify a wound and then handed down like an heirloom to the next. My dad called that night. He sounded different from any version of himself I could remember, flatter, stripped of the ease that usually coated his voice. He said he had spent the afternoon thinking. He said he'd gone back and found the old letters in the box I had described. He said he had read all of them, including some he hadn't opened in years. He said, I thought I was different from him. I really believed that. I told him I knew. He asked me if there was any way to come back from this. I told him I wasn't asking him to be a different person retroactively. I told him I was asking him to be a different person going forward. That meant honoring the repayment agreement with Daniel. That meant never again making a decision about my life without speaking to me first. That meant saying out loud to me, not to my mom, not to himself, that what he had done was not neutral. He said, it wasn't neutral. I made a choice and I told myself it was practical, and it wasn't. It was favoritism. And you deserved better. The words landed somewhere in my chest in a way that was nothing like relief and nothing like satisfaction. It was more like pressure, releasing from a place I hadn't known was pressurized. Daniel signed a repayment agreement 2 weeks later. My aunt, who had more influence in the family than anyone formally acknowledged, had made it very clear to my parents that the situation needed to be resolved in a way that was concrete and documented. She had also quietly offered to help me bridge the gap if the timeline was too slow, which I noted and did not forget. I enrolled at Hartfield the following September. The deposit came from a combination of the first repayment installment from Daniel and money I had been saving aggressively for the better part of a year, including by picking up freelance research contracts on evenings and weekends. I had told no one I was doing this, because I had learned not to advertise a plan while it was still a plan. The night I confirmed my enrollment, I sat in the same kitchen where I'd gotten the bank notification 11 months before, and I allowed myself to feel something uncomplicated for once. Not joy exactly, but solidity. The feeling of having stood on ground that gave way, and found firmer ground somewhere else, and walked there under your own power. There is still a version of my family that is uncomfortable. My mom and I have a relationship that is courteous and careful in a way it wasn't before, which is both a loss and a kind of progress. She has started therapy, which I know only because my dad mentioned it without elaborating, and I have not pressed for details. Daniel is paying back the money in monthly installments. He has not tried to return to the original warmth we had before all of this, which I think is because he doesn't know how, and I have not offered him a map. That part may change. It may not. My dad and I talk on the phone most Sundays. It is different from what it was, more honest in places that used to be papered over with pleasantness. He has not brought up the letters again, but sometimes he says things that tell me he is still turning them over. Last month he told me, out of nowhere, that he was proud of me not for landing on my feet, but for refusing to keep the fall private. I didn't say anything back right away. Then I told him that meant something. And it did. Here is what I know now that I did not know on that Tuesday morning with the cold coffee and the $47. Being the easy one is not a compliment. It is a description of how you have learned to survive in a system that rewards the loudest emergency. When you are quiet and capable and self-sufficient, people do not see grace. They see availability. They see margin. They see the place where resources can be redirected without consequence. Because you'll be fine. You always land on your feet. You are not obligated to stay quiet to keep the peace. The peace you keep with your silence is not your peace. It belongs to everyone else. And you are the one paying for it. And this, if your family has treated you like the budget version of itself, if your needs have always been the ones deferred until later and later never comes, if you have spent years making yourself small so the household could stay intact, the shape you've learned to hold is not your actual shape. It is the shape of accommodation. And you are allowed to stop accommodating. You are allowed to stop. Now, I want to hear from you. If you were in my position, if you found out someone had quietly spent your future and told themselves you'd understand, what would you have done? Would you have confronted them privately, let it go to keep the family together, or done something more public? And which person in this story do you relate to most? Tell me in the comments. I read all of them.